Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's September 6th. I've had another flying lesson, but it is time for another batch of deep space updates. And we start by rewinding to go over all the launches, which started out kind of slowly. Back in 22nd of August, we had a Long March 7A launching ChinaSat 4A into geostationary Earth orbit out of Wangchang. This is actually the second launch of a ChinaSat satellite in the last few months. We had one back in June. Now, the next thing that we expected to happen was Polaris Dawn, but it was ready to go and then they had to delay it. They took the rocket down and they basically delayed the launch due to helium system issues. And then there was weather delays in Polaris, so SpaceX set up a couple of Starlink launches. And on 28th of August, they flew Starlink Group 86 on booster 1062, their life leader. 23 launches, it successfully put Starlink into orbit, and then as it returned to the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. It turned out there was a little more gravitas than it expected on one of the legs, and the rocket has fallen over and destroyed itself. Now, that led to a temporary grounding of all SpaceX rockets. There's a chance for other, space launch providers to really corner the market, right? So yeah, on the 29th of August, we had Series 1S launched by Galactic Energy. Its mission was called How Far I'll Go. It launched its payload, it launched from a facility called the Don Fang Hang Tiangang, which is also known as their sea platform in the Yellow Sea. This launched their payload into a low Earth sun-synchronous orbit, and I believe that there's 3 Yanyao 1 meteorology satellites and some other satellites involved. So it was a total of 6 satellites. And then, yes, 2-3 days later, after the SpaceX temporary grounding, Falcon 9 returned to flight. After all, it was only a booster failure, it was only a landing failure. It didn't really represent much hazard. So yes, Starlink launch Group 8-10 launched out of Cape Canaveral, Slick 40, 21 satellites. And that was very quickly followed by a Falcon 9 launching Starlink Group 9-5 out of Vandenberg Space Force Base. So back in the game, but we still haven't had a proper report on what happened to Booster 1062. 3rd of September, Long March 4B launching Yaogan, 6 reconnaissance satellites into low Earth orbit. That's a pretty common China launch. 5th of September, we had the final launch of the stock Vega. Now, the Vega C is going to continue to fly, but this was the original Vega, and it launched the Sentinel-2C Earth observation satellite out of Kourou in South America. Now, this was a delayed launch because originally the final stage for this, the fuel tanks, had been lost and then were later located in a landfill after having been crushed. So they needed to come up with a solution. The solution they used was to get the slightly larger tanks from the Vega C and build a new stage around those. So this was a one-off Vega with Vega C tankage on the upper stage. So, but this ultimately worked out. Sentinel-2C is in orbit and Vega C is going to be the rocket going forward. So now Europe, it's lost a launcher, but Vega C is coming back soon. 5th of September, we had the Falcon 9 launching Starlink out of Cape Canaveral, Group 8-10, 21 satellites in that batch. And over in China, on the 5th, we had a Long March 6 carrying 10 GSAT-3. And so this is a mobility communications constellation for Chinese automaker Geely. So they've launched 30 of these satellites, although it's interesting that this is on a Long March 6, whereas the other ones are launched on Long March 2C. The 6th of September, finally, last night, Falcon 9 launched NROL 113 Starshield, 21 Starshield satellites that's built with Northrop Grumman. And that was successful, but it wasn't as spectacular as I hoped, even after having set up my cameras. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we also had a suborbital launch of Blue Origin's New Shepard, NS-26. It was the first flight since the parachute issue back in May. They took 6 people, including a NASA researcher, Rob Furl from the University of Florida, who conducted experiments on gene expression during different, phases of the flight. We also had Karsten Kitchen, who I think her dad paid for her to fly, and she's like a student in North Carolina, and therefore apparently the youngest woman to fly over this Kármán line. There's I'm an Yankeer who was paid to fly by the Moon DAO, the cryptocurrency people. If you remember, I think that was the same person that bid $28 million or something ridiculous to fly on the very first New Shepard. And then you've got Nicolina Elric, Eugenia Grin, Ephraim Rabin. And we are still waiting on the big actual tourist space flight, Polaris Dawn. The weather just has not worked, and at this point, given that it's a 5-day mission and they haven't announced they're launching, there's a pretty good chance they might overlap with Soyuz MS-26, which is launching in a week or so. Anyway, also relevant, I guess, is that a shortfall of Gravitas came back to port carrying the remains of booster 1062, and as amateur space accident investigators tried to see if we could figure out any new clues from the wreckage, but a lot of it was covered up in tarps, because of ITAR, which I guess makes those I-tarps. But yeah, the legs were splayed out in various places. There was broken stuff. It was hard to tell what broke before or after things followed. But it is very cool to see, like, the rocket fell in one direction and then there are like COPV helium bottles are over the other side of the ship that clearly had to rocket there. Yes, rockets after landing. Anyway, yeah, it's like, I'm gonna get the heck out of this falling rocket. So as I explained in my other video about Starliner, the crew are now going to be returning on SpaceX's Crew 9, and that means that Crew 9, which is going to launch later this month, is only going to launch with a crew of 2 instead of a crew of 4, and as I predicted, Nick Hague will be the commander and Alexander Gorbanov from Roscosmos will fly, because you have to have the Russian guy, because that's the deal with Roscosmos, and since the other US crew members on Crew 9 had no ISS experience, they had to put Nick Hague on there. Well, that meant that mission commander Zena Cardman is being bumped to a later flight, which is unfortunate. So yeah, that spacecraft is going to undock today. It's going to land in White Sands. It'll maybe be visible flying over Mexico if you are along the descent path. So take a look for that tomorrow night, tonight. Yeah, it's soon. It'll be a great show. Starliner also had an interesting moment where Butch was hearing some strange sounds. He communicated down about it. He played these sounds back. He described them as sounding like sonar. And this was great news fodder. What if Starliner isn't just failing due to Teflon seals? What if it's haunted? But no, it was just a communications configuration that, because the way stuff was routed, there was a feedback loop in there with a bit of a delay, and that meant sounds would be amplified and you would create these rhythmic pings. It was basically like a delay effect on any audio. Okay, over in China, we know that Chinese spaceplane landed. We don't know anything more about it. We still don't have any proper pictures of it, but we're pretty sure that it must have landed at the Lopnur Air Base because the previous ones have landed there, and that's where the orbit was passing over roughly about the time when they talked about the return. So that's 267 days in orbit and still a complete mystery. Over in Europe, in Norway, the Andøya spaceport has received a license from Norway's Ministry of Trade and everything that will allow it to conduct orbital launches from the site. So this is like way north up in the Arctic Circle, and it will be the launch site for the German company ISAR Aerospace, which is building a rocket called the Spectrum launch vehicle. I don't know much more about this. There is another rocket company in Germany, Rocket Factory Augsburg, and of course they had a somewhat spectacular failure of their booster at Saxevord Spaceport in Shetland Islands, north of Scotland. And we got some footage of that last time, but now we actually have a few more details that there was a turbopump failure that turned into an oxygen fire. That is where metal is burning in oxygen. The shutdown did not go as planned, and ultimately the booster was consumed by the fire. And, they're going to have to rebuild that whole thing. NASA has added 3 new providers to its Vader program. That's a venture class acquisition of our dedicated and rideshare possibilities. So this is a bit like NASA's launch services program, where they match their satellites up with launch providers, but this is supposed to be the lower cost, higher risk version. So the 3 new providers that have been added are Aerospace, Impulse Space and Momentous Space. And, Impulse and Momentous, they build these on-orbit tugs, which will launch typically on a Falcon 9 rideshare and then deploy hardware to other orbits. And, so this is just new possibilities. A lot of the other launch providers, by the way, were actually launch providers, and many of them are no longer in business. But Vader has been used for things like the Tropics mission, which launched on Rocket Lab's Electron successfully, and that was also used for the Pre-Fire mission, again launched on a Rocket Lab vehicle. And Blue Origin is going to launch the Escapade mission to Mars on their New Glenn rocket. And literally while I was recording this video, NASA put out an announcement saying that the New Glenn launch of Escapade is being delayed by 6 months until spring of 2025. Blue Origin instead is going to launch a Blue Ring spacecraft to demonstrate the rocket, and presumably because they have such excess performance for a rocket this big and spacecraft that small, that allows them to hit launch windows that other rockets might not be capable, but it does demonstrate there is a significant risk of being the first payload on a new rocket. And Tim Dodd also posted his second part of his Rocket Factory tour with Jeff Bezos, and I'm going to say, Jeff looks great, I think it was a great decision for him to stop that whole Amazon thing and get deep into rockets, because customers complain all the time and you can never satisfy them, but the laws of physics, you know exactly what you have to do to make them happy. Firefly, they have got their Blue Ghost lander in the test facilities, the vacuum, acoustic, vibration, thermal stuff over at JPL. They're making sure this vehicle is safe for flying on the Falcon booster to the moon and hopefully landing. In addition to this, of course, they've done a bunch of other tests at their facilities in Texas. They've been flying drones with navigation suites and sensors on board over a simulated lunar landscape. They've performed simulated landing tests, so that's hopefully going to launch later this year. And also, we got a report from Astrobotic on what happened to the Peregrine spacecraft, and the explanation is that it was a failure in a pressure control valve that stopped sealing properly. And it stopped sealing, they think, due to vibration-induced relaxation of threaded components. That is, they had, threads, like things that were screwed into each other, and vibration caused them to slightly unscrew to the point that the valve was no longer sealing. And that meant that the helium regulator wouldn't stop the flow of helium to pressurize the tanks. And eventually, the tanks overpressurized, and they were left without a propulsion system that was operating, at the levels needed to land on the moon. So presumably they're going to redesign the valve in some way. I'm not sure how, because valves are complicated and complex, and they're always responsible for things going wrong. Valves, we love them, but we hate them. We hate them, but we can't live without them. ABL Space Systems announced at the end of August that they are having to let go of a bunch of their staff. They're downsizing. And I don't have an exact number on this, but according to some sources, which I cannot verify the veracity of, it could be as much as half of their staff. And this is unfortunate. Back in July, they were having a static test of one of their boosters, and it failed, and they lost that booster. And so we did actually get details on what went wrong, or a few more details. It's going to be a full 11-engine test, and they actually shut down the test early because engine number 10 was showing dubious pressure readings, and that was apparently a bad sensor. But then a fire started, fed by fuel leaking from engine 5 and 8. The fire suppression system kicks in, and they're just containing the fire, but they're unable to put it out. And eventually the test stand runs out of water because they didn't have a water pipe to it. They just had a big water tank. And so the fire runs out of control and eventually destroys the booster. Now, the engines 5 and 8, they apparently leaked because there was significant erosion of the injectors on those engines, and that was consistent with combustion instability induced failure. So this is quite a complicated failure. They may have to come and go do some engine redesign. And we have another detailed report from the NASA Office of Inspector General about how SLS is costing too much and taking too long. This time it is about the second mobile launch tower, which is being designed and built by Bechtel. And So this, of course, is the second tower. The first one is needed to launch the baseline SLS, which uses the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. And they're going to be transitioning to the exploration upper stage, which is taller, so they needed a bigger tower. And back when this was being planned, they thought the SLS would be launching so fast that they wouldn't have time to have, convert one tower into the other. Oh, how prescient they weren't. So yeah, this tower has to be built in parallel, and it was supposed to be like less than $1 billion, which seems ridiculous. It's now looking that it might cost as much as $2.9 billion. This is one of those cost plus contracts where the cost estimates, Bechtel stand to make a certain amount of money regardless of how much money this thing it costs, and they're fronting the costs of all this. Look, now, NASA, of course, and Bechtel are saying, no, you're just taking a linear approximation. It's not going to cost nearly 2.9 billion. It's only going to cost 2.6 billion. That'll only be 1.6 billion more than we expected. A steel tower to launch. Yeah, go and read these reports. It just... And the problem isn't that they're spending a lot of money. The problem is really that they're taking all this money from other things that are doing better things with the money they get. Okay, speaking of launch facilities, Evolution Space and the Spaceport Company performed a test launch of a sounding rocket from a ship in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the Spaceport Company, their whole thing is to have these like jack platforms that can set up just off the course, anchor themselves, and launch rockets, because they argue that launch facilities are a limiting factor in the US, which has lots of populated areas. The Evolution Space, they are building small sounding rockets and hoping to scale up. They actually are hoping to build solid rockets for the US military. So I think this was like a sort of collaboration for their various contracts to try and, move forward with that. But it's very cool to see a launch from a ship in the US. And speaking of ships, Blue Origin have unveiled their landing ship. It finally sailed into town, and it's about the same size as the SpaceX ones, although the facilities at either end of the barge are built up a little higher. But it's about the same width, because if you think about it, it has to move through like the Panama Canal if it's ever going to get to the west coast. So this one is named Jacqueline, after Jeff Bezos' mum, and I think that's a fantastic sentiment. But Jeff, you do realize that this thing is supposed to catch large rockets, and rockets are shaped like a certain piece of human anatomy, and I'm not sure you want the vision of your mum catching these to be... never mind. I'm sorry. That's why my mind went, right? But yeah, they've got their second stage now out in a test stand. They're hoping to do like some testing and verify it with the BE 3 engines, which are of course hydrogen engines needed for the upper stage. Over at Mercury, Bepi Colombo flew past the planet in another gravity assist, and this one is different from the original plan, because earlier this year Bepi Colombo began to develop issues with its ion thruster propulsion system, and that meant it was only getting about 90% of the performance it needed, which means they have to redesign the trajectory. So they moved this particular pass a little closer to the moon, or to the planet, and it's going to come around. It's going to take another 11 months to get to Mercury. But, we did get a cool fly past, and I think this is actually be closer than it will ever get in the mission. Now, unfortunately, it didn't have the full scientific camera system available, because that's blocked by the propulsion unit that detaches once it gets there. But we do get some great footage or shots from the engineering cameras showing Mercury up close. And if you want to see a bit of space up close, well, a bit of space came to us this week. An asteroid 2024 RW1 was found just before impact by the Catalina Sky Survey in Tucson, Arizona. This is only the 9th asteroid to have been discovered before it impacted the Earth. So we got this predicted, and sure enough, plenty of people managed to get images of this descending over the Philippines. And so, with that, the next thing we're going to watch for falling back to Earth will be Starliner, and we'll get to find out whether it truly was a gamble that should have been taken, or whether Crew 9 will actually have saved the day. I don't know, but this is going to happen. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.